a soft chronicle of winter nights in medieval cottages, tracing how common folk found warmth, order, and unhurried rest through the cold months. Twilight drew in early in a village of timber frames and strawed eaves, a lowering blue over hedge and byre. Smoke rose from louved roofs and drifted along the lane where cart ruts had frozen and thawed and frozen again. In houses made of oak posts and wattle, daubed and lime-washed where coin or custom allowed, the winter evening arranged itself with patient economy. The beasts were stalled, the last pails set down, and a thin dog curled by the doorway where a draught crept under the sill. The year turned slowly through Advent and Christmastide, and on towards Candlemas, and the steady customs of cold weather held their shape as surely as the earth floor underfoot. The open hearth, set upon a clay patch or stones reddened by years of banking, gave a low and practical light. Smoke shouldered upwards to the darkened rafters and out through the vent. In foul weather it hung and thinned and hung again. The ease of the night would be measured by small means. Embers banked under ash, a candle pinched low, a latch lifted only once more before bed. These households, recorded in manorial rolls and glimpsed in marginal pictures of psalters, made warmth by tending rather than by abundance. The slow turn of the lens found them at ordinary ease, hands still and breath visible when someone stepped out for water. The patient ledger of their days balanced tonight as it had the night before. Fuel counted, bread portioned, a little ale set aside. A bed began with the floor, tamped and levelled with care. On this, in most cottages, stood a frame of wood pegged to hold its shape, posts plain just enough to take the roughness off, a headboard that creaked when leaned upon. Across the frame ran cords or laths, knotted and tightened with a stick or simple key, a small tool that turned in the hands like other necessary things. The peat spade, the distaff, the forked branch that lifted the kettle across the fire. The mattress, a palliasse, was stuffed with straw, oat or rye often saved from the threshing floor, and stitched into a tick of linen or hempen cloth. In some places, marsh reed was preferred for the way it settled and resisted damp. The straw was changed at intervals, at Martinmas if the stores allowed, or turned and shaken when time was lean. Over this lay a bolster, then blankets of coarse wool. Records suggest that fleeces and skins, whether sheep or goat or an old pelt fetched at fair, were prized for their closeness of warmth. A coverlet, sometimes thick with home-dyed yarn, might be spread when guests were present, or folded and kept for the best, for a saint's day or a relative's visit with news from another manor. Curtains for the bed, coarse hangings to keep back the draught, were not sure things in small cottages, yet sacking, spare cloth, or a woven length of rushes could be pinned or slung to make a lean-to of stillness around the pallet. Children slept on truckles that slid under the frame by day, or on pallets of straw, or beside kin where bodies lent each other heat. In longhouses of the west and north, where byre and hall shared a roof and a cross-passage divided warmth from winter, the nearness of cattle lent a living heat that rose, slow and generous, under the loft. Iron by the hearth sat ready, fire dogs to hold the burning, a trivet for simmering, a hooked chain to raise or lower the pot, bellows patched with care. Light came from the fire, from tallow dips set in iron prickets, from rushlights, reeds dried and soaked in grease, burning with a thin wavering loyalty. Where wood was scarce, faggots gathered in autumn had to be stretched through the season. Where peat was cut on the common, turves were stacked and dried for months, and their earthy smoke kept the room dusky but alive with heat. Sea coal reached some towns by the 13th century, brought by boat and carted inland, though it was seldom the portion of the poorest. In villages set back from great roads, wood, furs, and peat prevailed. The slow turn of the lens settled again on hands at work. Straw teased into the tick, cords firmed, a blanket shaken in the cold dusk and folded back. The patient ledger noted what could be spared tonight, a fresh tuft of straw, a sliver of tallow, and what must wait for better fortune. With dark laid over the field, supper was the hinge that swung the house towards sleep. A pot of pottage warmed, peas and beans, a handful of barley, onion, leek, and the heel of salted pork or a streak of bacon when luck held. Bread, often maslin made of mixed wheat and rye, was cut with a knife honed on the same stone that smoothed loom weights. A little cheese, white and young, sat beside the pot, and ale was poured into a shared cup. In years of plenty the crust was thick and easily shared. In years of dearth the knife hesitated, and the measure was exact. Chronicles tell of hard winters when grain was scarce and loaves were smaller. The years around the Great Famine in the early 14th century were remembered for their relentlessness. Yet even in a lean year, households tended to the same modest comfort. The pot set aside, the spoon licked clean, a story traded, a prayer said. After the meal there was a soft chore time that did not press the blood. Mending a strap, turning a sock, carding wool in steady strokes that made a quiet rush in the air. An elder's cough was listened to and, if needed, a cloth warmed by the fire and laid over the chest. A pot stone wrapped in linen might be tucked under the blankets to take off the first edge of cold, though not every place kept such things. In some towns the curfew bell marked the hour for covering the fire, the old couvre-feu, and shutters were drawn across the glow. In hamlets without a bell the hour rang itself by habit, by the soft closing of the outer door and the draught's touch on the tongue. They slept in layers of stillness. Sleep came early in winter, yet seldom ran unbroken. The notion of a first sleep and a second is reflected in later testimonies and earlier hints. Waking after midnight to tend the fire, to talk in low voices, to visit a neighbour for a birth, or to watch for a ewe in labour. In those quiet mid-hours the room held a listening quality. The embers glowed like small fruits under ash. The patient ledger turned another line. One more turf for the fire, one more stitch, one more whispered plan for the morning. Far from the lane and the thatch, the weather worked its own measures. Winters varied over the centuries. Some years saw clear, hard frosts that crisped the ruts and glittered on hedgerow berries. Some brought wet and wind, with sleet that flattened the straw on the stacks and made boots heavy with clay. From the 14th century, some chroniclers noticed harsher seasons, with rivers sheeting over and ferryways stalled, though such notices were irregular and local. A snow might lie for days and then melt within hours under a sudden southerly blow. On such nights, a sledge could be dragged on frozen turf, and where the manor granted wood rights, bundles were hauled home in careful stacks. On other nights, river people moved quietly along watercourses with low punts, bringing salt fish and news as far as ice allowed. The slow turn of the lens found the same gentle activities against different weathers. Dogs shaking off rime, youths stamping their feet before slipping into bed, an elder blowing on a rushlight to thin the smoke. Inside, warmth was made more by manner than by means. The door was hung with a thick cloth on a nail, a wicker screen set between the beds and the coldest wall, the best blanket kept for the oldest shoulders. Where a cottage adjoined another, the common wall held heat better than a stand-alone hut. Where a loft was boarded, a sleeping place under the roof kept the warmth of breath and body close. In the long houses of Devon and the far north, cattle stabled under wooden lofts gave off a breathy warmth that softened frost on uprights by dawn. It was ordinary to sleep several to a bed, spouses, children, kin, sometimes a labourer hired for threshing time or a widow taken in for a season. In this joining of warmth there was nothing of drama, only bodies calm and arranged for rest. Midnight worked through to the hour before dawn. In that watch, the house was seldom completely silent. A ewe might call, thin and questioning. A loose thatch millet would tap the eaves. Somewhere a wooden gutter creaked. Someone in the bed turned and cords murmured under the mattress. Where candles had been used, a stub was carefully pinched and saved. Where only the fire had given light, hands knew the place of everything without looking. A crock sat cool, ready for morning grain. The spinning distaff leaned in its accustomed corner. A child waking from a small dream or a cold toe pressed closer and returned to breathing with the measured hush of sleep. Embers banked under ash. The patient ledger waited without hurry, counting nothing now, the ink of thought thinned to a winter grey. These hours between sleeps could hold a different kind of work. In some places men turned the handles of querns, keen to grind before cock-crow. In others women set a dough by the embers, ready for baking on the iron, the moment daylight was enough to see by. In villages near woods, snares set in the gloaming were checked with a burlap bag and a lantern made from a horn scraped thin. If the weather held steady, a neighbour might pass with a quiet knock to share news from a court day. A fine levied, a strip granted, a stray pig claimed. Those who kept the parish bell or the watch in towns howled neither warnings nor alarms. It was enough to pace, to be a listening presence. The slow turn of the lens marked all of this gently and moved on. Towards dawn the house quickened, the second sleep loosened, and cold met faces with a soft insistence. Someone rose to stir the embers. Ash was moved aside with an iron spoon, and the coal and wood coaxed back to flame, or a turf was put to take the heat. The kettle, blacked by years, was swung on its hook, and the first steam drew a ribbon through light that was only just gathering. Day came later in deep winter, and work did not wait for full sun. Before the lane brightened, beasts were fed. A few oats were tossed. Chaff was shaken out. A calf nosed at a pail and left a wet muzzle on a cuff. In the yard, the well was rimmed with a skin of ice. A stick snapped it and water rang against the bucket. Children pulled on wool between fingers and thumb and stood up with startled hair from the rubbing. Breakfast was an uncomplicated affair. Porridge of barley or oats was favoured, warmed again if last night's pot had been wisely sized. A hunk of bread with a smearing of dripping, or a heel sopped in the porridge, or a clove of garlic and a pinch of salt cherished from autumn's fare. Ale was for breakfast as well as supper. Weak and warming, it steadied the day. In some places, a soft cheese was a treat. In others, dried apples or a few preserved plums offered a winter sweetness. The old put their hands to the steam and found the morning friendly again. Wages and prices drifted like quiet considerations beneath all this habit. The statute of labourers set its bounds in the mid-14th century, yet records suggest coin and season argued constantly. In some years, a labourer might take a few pence more for a winter's ditching. In others, work was taken for less with the promise of grain or a place by the fire. A day's pay in a good year might buy a pair of faggots and a small cheese, or a length of coarse cloth when winter had been kind to the sheep. In lean years, coin's reach was shorter, and neighbours shared in the old way. One family lending a blanket, another offering peat from their stack. The patient ledger recorded these borrowings without reproach. Settlements were made at fair or in spring. The fields at the edge of the village were quiet under frost. Footpaths ran between strips, ridge and furrow, like the slow waves of land set in order by generations. In January and February, hedging and ditching kept hands warm. In the byre, dung was forked with a slow rhythm and carried to the headland to wait for better light. In some regions, carts fitted with iron-tired wheels were pulled on frozen ground. In others, sledges were dragged over rime-crusted turf to save a beast's breath. When a distant market called, pack horses took the lane, bells muted by cloth, their hooves biting into ground that would soon be a river of mud once the thaw came. On rivers, where ice was thin or not at all, low craft moved with the weight of salt fish, malt, or timber. Crossings were watched with care, and breath plumed when the ferryman laughed at an old story he had told every winter for 20 years. Such movements brought news with them. A cousin had married, a priest had been posted to another living, the price of malt had shifted, a distant abbey had sent for peat. With the news came ordinary comforts too, a spool of thread with a better twist, a needle, a pot mended by a tinker whose hand was known and trusted, a little lye for washing. The slow turn of the lens included each of these with the same attention it gave to the folded blanket and the banked ember. Across the island, the arrangements of sleeping altered with terrain. In the fenlands, peat cut in summer gave back its stored sun in winter. Houses stood on planks or raised ground, their floors scattered with rushes that were swept and renewed when they began to smell of smoke and boots. In upland climes, wind pressed itself everywhere, under doors, between slates along the eaves. Beds were set away from the coldest wall if space allowed, and chests held the household's better garments. Woolen kirtles and hose mended again and again, a cloak lined where coin had once made a day seem rich. In coastal places, the gull's cry threaded the night, and the scent of salt dampened and then spared the straw depending on how the wind turned. Here, a fisherman's cap hung by the door, stiff with salt, and a child fell asleep to the sea's persistent breath. In market towns, the curfew bell provided a small ordinance of quiet. Shutters were drawn then, and the night's governance handed over to the common law of sleep. The old and the young were watched over more closely in deep winter. A midwife came and went at all hours, and a woman's confinement meant fires set warmer and longer, water heated and kept at the ready, neighbours coming with broth and honey if bees had been kind. Those who could not afford long-burning fuel stayed close together, in a bed built narrow but deep enough for 2 or 3. The patient ledger added such nights to its pages as if they were currency of another sort, held among kin rather than sealed with wax. The ledger of small things filled its winter columns with careful measures. A gallon of ale drawn at a penny or 2, a loaf in good years weighed by the assize and bought with a farthing or more, a weight of salt reckoned by the handful for brining meat at Martinmas. A grey goose feather sewn into a pillow by someone proud of a neat seam. A short length of iron wire useful for hanging a kettle or for whatever else could be contrived. Accounts kept for a manor show, wages rising and falling with plagues and statutes. They show as well the small stipends of winter labour, ditching, hedging, carting muck, done in boots patched until the leather no longer held a stitch. A woman's hire at harvest might be repaid in grain at Candlemas. A boy's day carrying fuel could be traded for a broken, combed fleece for carding at home. A smith's work was taken on credit against spring repairs. Nothing was grand, yet everything was counted, weighed and brought into household order with the same care as embers pushed into their ash pocket. The slow turn of the lens caught the small coins on a table by firelight, and the line of chalk on a beam where tallies were kept. Meals matched the ledger's pacing. On fast days observed even where strictness loosened for labouring bodies, broth was made thinner and fish took the place of meat. Stockfish hammered on a block, herrings salted and soaked. On feast days in midwinter, when the parish sang and children looked for a treat, a pie appeared, meat under a thick lid, or a cake scented with a little spice that had journeyed through hands and saddlebags and ships before it came to this table. In seasons of sickness and sorrow, a pot of leeks and oats was medicine enough. There were no wasted gestures. A spoon scraped clean the pot. A cloth dried and folded was used again. Twine was saved. Worn straw from a pallet lined a hen's basket. Eased down came of its own accord. As evening returned, a second day drew its circle. The winter sky closed in and the house made itself inward again. Gloves were pushed under the bedclothes to be warmer for morning. A few words were read aloud if the house held the learning or the book. Psalter verses, a familiar line heard in church and loved for its rhythm. Those without letters had their own scriptures of habit. A blessing over the bread, a quiet thanks for a good birth, a murmured name spoken to the dead in a winter where scarcity had taken its portion. The fire was settled. Embers banked under ash. The dog turned twice. The slow turn of the lens found every object at rest, cast into gentle relief by the light it had worked to earn. Outside, frost might thicken on a gate's iron latch. Inside, hands checked the latch's wooden cousin and settled the bar. A last cup was poured and drunk. The candle was pinched out. Night started again, but with its small sciences well learned. If a blanket was too short, woolen hose were pulled higher. If the wind set upon the north side of the house, someone would shift the trunk that served as a stool and make a curtain of it, a deflection more felt than seen. Children whispered until speech thinned into sleep. Older voices trailed off in halfway dreams, half plans. Nothing pressed. The patient ledger folded itself into the silence and kept nothing back for quarrel. By the end of winter, Candlemas candles were blessed. The wax was scant in cottages, tallow more common, yet the time was marked in village and town. Seeds whispered in sacks. Plough Monday followed, and men and oxen returned to their collaborative work. The long cold lessened, then returned for a week, then let go. The bedding, turned and refreshed midwinter, waited for the day when it could be carried outside and beaten free of dust. The tick would be aired on a hedge in a pale sun and the straw within shaken. The room would smell of smoke, wool, and a late promise of earth thawing from its frost-hard rind. The slow turn of the lens widened, though only slightly, for the year would come round again, and winter would ask the same competence and receive it. What held through each turning was not a single implement or price or rule, but the shape of ordinary care. Beds were made tight or loose according to means. Fires burned high or low according to fuel and weather. The night's measure was taken with a quiet attention that did not admit much talk. Many slept together for the simple arithmetic of heat. Some slept near beasts, others above tools or under rafters where the smoke sweetened the timber against rot. In the deep centuries between the 12th and 15th, under varied skies and the weather's old surprises, winter nights shared this look. A house shut like a shell against the cold. A bed layered in coarse, honest cloth. Embers banked under ash. The patient ledger satisfied. The slow turn of the lens finding nothing rushed and nothing scarce that could be spared. In some cottages, the bed was raised upon simple trestles to lift it from damp that gathered in the earth floor, and the space beneath housed a chest for linens and the better garments kept for Sundays and holy days. Linens were scarce in many households. Coarse hemp cloth might serve as a sheet, softened with many washings and a spring beating on a wooden block. The bolster at the head of the bed held chaff or feathers when fortune had smiled at slaughter time, and feathers were plentiful after the plucking of geese and hens at Martinmas. Where flocks were small and feathers few, clean straw did the same work with an honest rustle. The cords under the palliasse were tightened with a short wooden key, turned with a steady wrist until the weave was taut. The phrase carried no flourish, only the quiet satisfaction of a bed made firm, a thing readied for use. The slow turn of the lens noticed a hand smoothing the tick with the flat of the palm. It noticed the small pause when someone listened to the wind at the shutters and judged whether to hang an extra cloth on the bed's cold side. Light had its own small economy. A tallow dip burned with a gentle guttering that left its scent on the air, and a thin soot on the beam above. Beeswax candles were for churches and for wealth, their clean flame a rare visitor in poor rooms. A rushlight, a reed peeled and dried and drawn through fat, gave a thread of brightness that could be moved from table to hearth and back again. Horn lanterns, thin slices scraped from ox horn and set into a frame, kept the draught from blowing the light to nothing when someone must step outside. In storm weather, the lantern's glow made a small island of certainty across the yard. One step and then another until the byre door was lifted. The patient ledger added such moments as if they were coins paid into a strongbox. The careful use of light, the spared wick, the trimmed rush. Fuel was winter's arithmetic. In wood-poor regions, the autumn's faggots, bundles of cut sticks gathered from hedgerow and common, must last until the sap turned again. Peat, cut from the moor or the moss in summer, stacked high under a covering of straw, burned with a steady earth smell. Where sea coal reached inland along river and road in the 13th century and after, its heat was strong, but its smoke was dense. Some households mixed a little with wood for a better burn. Furze and gorse, cut when the thorn was green and left to dry, flared fast and then left only a scant glow, good for a kettle brought quickly to the steam. In the fen places, turf fires kept a long bed of embers that answered well to the morning's stir. Embers banked under ash. The phrase repeated itself through the hours, a household catechism that made warmth stretch further than it otherwise could. Work shaped the body's ease. In winter, with ploughlands lying close and wet or frozen under the sky, there was hedging to be done, timber to be trimmed, thatch to be combed free of wind-blown chaff and relayered where a spar had loosened. Threshing in the barn ran with the beat of flails on the floor, a dry, calm percussion that did not startle sleep later but seemed to fold into it. Wool was carded and spun, distaff and spindle turned in patient circles. Coarse thread grew into skeins that would become hose, hoods, and the blankets that turned a bed into a shelter. In the peatlands, sledges dragged across frozen ground brought home slices cut square as loaves. In upland folds, sheep were brought closer to walls made of stone, dry laid, and their shelter stood close enough that sound and breath were present in the night, through the timbers. The slow turn of the lens saw hands red from cold water, stretched to the fire. It saw a boot stood on a stone to dry, steam lifting faintly from the leather. It saw a child folding the day's spun yarn onto a stick and making a careful notch with a little knife. The ordinary night remained the measure. Its routine was narrow and kind. A prayer over the fire, a hand on the latch, a glance upwards through smoke towards the hole in the roof where winter stars sometimes pricked the dark. The house's smells, wool, smoke, meat hung lightly salted from a beam, a little sour ale, the clean straw of the bed. settled into their places as the room cooled. The patient ledger kept counting, though numbers were not spoken aloud. One turf saved, one log withheld, one extra ladle in a porridge thickened for an elder whose strength had run low. Nothing of it was grand. Everything carried weight. Not all cottages were alike, and winter's answer varied with the land. In the north and west, longhouses kept people and cattle under one roof with a cross passage between. The beasts' heat rose through boards to the loft where pallets were laid. There, wind met timber and was slowed. Snow melted at the eaves from breath alone. In the east and southeast, where arable stretched in ridges and furrows towards distant woods, smaller cot houses stood alone or clustered in short runs along a lane. Here beds might be set closer to the hearth because a single room must do for much of living, the far end reserved for tools and stores. In Welsh uplands, the smokehouse, blackened from years of peat and oak, gave off a quiet, sweet reek. Meat hung high stayed safe, and a spare blanket kept the smoke from someone light of chest. In the fen, reed beds made fine thatch that shed water well and feathered under snow in a way that pleased old eyes. A sleeping loft under such a roof kept airy in summer and calm in winter with doors shut and a rush mat pushed against a draught. Where towns had grown, timber frontages with jettying upper floors leaned over lanes that froze and thawed and froze again. Above a shop, a weaver or fuller lay on a narrow bed near a small brazier. Charcoal watched carefully for safety. A pot of size or dye was covered and set aside. Neighbours shared walls, and the heat that gathered on one side eased the other. The curfew sounded from a tower at set hours. A cover for the fire was drawn into place, and the neighbourhood settled into its regulated dark. In such places, winter strictness met winter habit. The one softened the other. The slow turn of the lens took in the bell and the shutters and the distant footfall of a watchman whose pace never hurried. Food took a winter turn that slept kindly in the stomach. Pottage remained a constant. A pot hung low over a banked fire and thickened through the evening. Oats swelling, peas softening, chopped kale tendering at the edges. On better tables, salted pork or a scrap of mutton made depth. On most, an onion and a handful of barley gave the taste of the year's stores used well. Cheese, eaten young in summer, had been turned and salted for keeping. Its harder cousin in winter was sliced thin and savoured. Butter was a winter scarcity, though some households kept a crock within reach of the fire's warmth to soften what had been set aside. Fish came inland from coasts on winter roads by pack horse and cart. Herring salted and strung in pairs, stockfish wood and hard and needing a mallet and patience. On Fridays and fast days, pots made sea room for the palate. In Advent and Lent, the same habit ran deeper and steadier. Children slept heavy on porridge. Elders welcomed a mug of warmed ale, thin and good, poured at the edge of sleep. Prices and wages moved with time and with strain, and winter marked the differences. In the 13th century, a day's labour on the manor might bring a few pence and food. Later, after pestilence had thinned numbers, coin rows and laws at Westminster attempted to pin it back to earlier measures. Even then, winter's work had its own valuation. Ditching and hedging, carting ice-crusted muck, bringing timber from a coppice, carrying water when the well mouth held ice. A pair of faggots cost money or favour. A quarter of malt could be a season's comfort in ale if carefully brewed. The patient ledger did not speak its sums aloud, but it showed itself in behaviour. In a blanket mended rather than replaced. In a bed's straw turned and saved. In a sleeping place made for a widower because no one should be cold alone. There were habits to restrain the cold without a flame. Bedstocks, Simple wooden devices like fat rollers could be heated by the hearth and wrapped, then rolled under the coverlet to take off the first bite. More often, a warmed stone in linen served. Sand warmed in a pot did the same in some districts, poured into a bag that laid a small heat under toes. Bed hangings pulled close held breath warm. Where cloth was short, a blanket pegged across simple uprights made a snug sleeping corner. Woolen caps kept heat from leaving. Infants wore soft caps and were swaddled finer in winter, their wrappings regularly checked to keep them easy. Old bones were guarded at the extremities, a second pair of hose, gloves under a blanket, a cloak drawn over the bed as if it were a roof pulled closer. The slow turn of the lens took in these careful gestures, their simplicity and their repetition, and let the room grow quiet around them. Pests troubled summer more than winter, yet winter had its own enemies. Damp crept if the wind stayed southwest and the earth refused to let go of its wet. In such weeks, a bed moved to the hearth side for a time, and the straw inside a tick was aired when sun allowed. Herbs gathered in high summer gave back calm in winter. Meadow sweet and lavender laid under the sheet brought a dry sweetness, and were thought to discourage small biting things. Rosemary bound and hung from a peg lent courage to the air. A broom of birch did its rounds and kept corners clear. In the long sleep of the year, such little acts quieted the mind and made the bed an island. Embers banked under ash. The phrase returned with each nightfall and each morning's stir. Weather declared itself to those who kept winter hours. Frost formed lace at the window's animal horn panes, or at the paper oiled and stretched where glass was absent. On dry nights, stars held steady, and wolves were not a fear in these centuries where land had been settled to the hedge. Instead, it was the fox at the hen house, or the path's slipperiness that drew a moment's thought. When snow came, it silenced the lane and made the world smaller, safe within, muffled without. Thor turned everything to labour. Boots came in heavy, a mat of woven rushes waited at the door, and a child took a stick to scrape the clinging clay as if it were a game. In riverside settlements, ice sometimes edged the water and forced ferrymen to seek a narrower crossing. The craft that brought eels and saltfish judged each morning newly, and news travelled accordingly, slower or swifter with the weather's leave. The patient ledger did not record the weather in words, but it entered in its sums as surely as if noted in neat script, a lost day's hauling, a week's worth of fuel saved by mildness, a pair of shoes mended sooner than hoped because the road was cruel. Church and calendar gave winter a softness of rhythm. Advent quieted the parish. Christmastide brightened it with candles and song. Epiphany turned an ordinary star into a story to be carried home and retold by the hearth. At Candlemas, wax was blessed in the nave and carried home as light and hope. These were not luxuries. They were the household's way of keeping time when days were short. After Hocktide and Plough Monday, the land began to exert its claims again, and sleep shifted towards the hours allowed by work. Through all of this, the bed was a constant instrument. Without ceremony, hands set it to rights each morning. Straw spilled and was swept. A blanket hung in a week's sun. A tick's seam earned another line of coarse, durable stitching. The slow turn of the lens, returning night after night, found no novelty in this, only a dependable small beauty. Neighbours shaped the winter night beyond household walls. In hamlets, doors were near enough for a knock to be heard even with wind running along a lane. Childbirth called women across thresholds at any hour. A shepherd's lantern crossed a yard at midnight when a lamb had come early. a cow with a hard carving called a man to fetch the one who knew what to do. Old men watched stars and spoke of weather's old patterns, the hard freeze in a remembered year, the thaw that broke a cartwheel on a day otherwise set for hedging. The village reeve moved with an even tread when the manor called for account or for notice of a change in the commons. When illness visited a house, neighbours brought broth and placed wood by the door without knocking. Sleep slackened in some quarters and deepened in others, the whole place balancing itself out with unremarked grace. The patient ledger ran through more than coin. It ran through favours tallied in hearts. Along roads that tied countryside to market town, winter traffic had its own register. Carters timed their loads to frost if possible, preferring a hard ground to the sucking grip of thaw. Bells on harnesses were wrapped in cloth at nightfall in town, and unwrapped on the open road where sound warned of approach at a blind turn. At bridges, ferrymen and toll-keepers were tolerant of those who walked because their steps were slower in winter. A wool-capped head nodded and waved someone across who had paid earlier in the week. Inns took in more traffic on bad nights, and a bench near a fire gave mercies to more than travellers. Sometimes a villager with a long way home slept sitting up and woke grateful to stiffness rather than the cold. In this motion, modest and familiar, nothing intruded on the simple end of each day. Bed, blanket, banking the embers, the same words said, the same lamp pinched. Some practices seem certain and some only likely. Records suggest segmented sleep, first sleep, then waking, then second sleep, held through late medieval years and lingered long after. Parish books and household accounts are stronger on bread and fuel than on bedding. Yet wills occasionally bequeathed a feather bed or a best blanket with the same seriousness as a pig or a pan. From such bequests, a picture can be drawn of hunger for warmth and for comfort taken in measure. In places where inventories survive, a bedstead appears alongside a chair, a table, a chest and tools. A second bed may mark hospitality or a larger family. Patterns are broad. Houses and lives were particular. The slow turn of the lens lets generalities sit lightly and looks instead at the way a hand pats a bed smooth before the candle goes, as if to say, the day can end well. A winter night's middle span sometimes welcomed quiet talk that would not fit in daytime. An elder's story was better told when all was still. A plan for a pig bought at the next fair could be shaped more readily when the mind was soft-edged. Lovers murmured when the house's many sleepers had settled. A small child's clear breath guided a mother's own back to even pace. If the fire had fallen low, someone worked the bellows gently or blew where the ash thinned to draw the orange back from its hiding. Ash and ember made their conversation and gave the room again a low, busy glow. Embers banked under ash. The phrase held a settled content, a small incantation that never hurried. When snow fell thick and stayed, the light at night time changed. It entered the house darkly and made a blueness that seemed almost a sound. At such times the house took on a deeper hush. In the morning the same snow lent a temporary brightness to floor and beam, as if the sky had been knocked and a persistent white dust were shaking down through the louvre. Children scrambled to the door and then shivered back again to the warmth, and blankets folded for years remembered their work and did it well. Later winter had tasks that prepared for spring, yet belonged to winter's patience. Tools were set in order against ploughing and sowing. Ox yokes were checked for splits, and plough irons sharpened. Seeds stored in sacks were aired by a window when sun showed, turned and sniffed for any hint of damp. Hens began to lay again under burlap-covered baskets, and their quiet confidence was a comfort to those who counted eggs. as a sign that the world intended its old kindness. Byres were mucked, and the yards swept without haste. Such work put the body into a sleep that was thick and kind. Meals remained simple. A ham hung high was sliced as if to keep it for a long future. The pot's broth altered by small degrees with what came to hand. The patient ledger smiled without showing its teeth. It knew the house would come through. In coastal places, winter brought its own listening. A gull at distance became a cue the mind no longer heard closely. Tides could be counted by sound in the night. Fishermen, used to rising by their own inner clocks, woke to the fit of tide and wind. A man on a pallet near a net heard the faint shift of a knot in the dark and checked it with his fingers even in his sleep. Habit wrapped him like a blanket. In river towns with small quays, the thud of a mooring post in frost echoed wistfully, and then stopped. All settled again. A brazier in a loft near linen, hung to dry, made a pocket of warmth, where someone slept with a contentment that belonged to common work done well. The slow turn of the lens lingered on a line of floats tidy on a shelf, and on the coarse cloth covering a window against spray and gusts. Everything tended towards ease. New babies altered sleep entirely, but not the principle. Women who had seen many winters knew which herbs calmed a fretful belly, which positions eased a mother's back, which songs soothed and made a small one lay its head more easily. Heat was kept in the room for such arrivals. Fuel was spent a little more generously. A midwife sat on a low stool, sipped warm ale, and knew when to say nothing. When an elder fell ill, the bed was brought nearer the fire, and a screen set to break a draught. The young bowed their heads and spoke softly when they passed. Winter made kinship visible. A blanket moved from one house to another. A cushion was lent, a jug of milk changed hands even when stores were slim. The patient ledger drew lines warm with gratitude. The town's quiet had its own music. In the hour after curfew, shutters knocked once or twice as the night wind found them. A barrel hoop contracted with cold and made a small sound like a plucked string. A cat padded across a sill. Somewhere, not far, a late worker folded his tools into a box and slid it under a bed. The work of linen or leather or brass was done for the day. For those who lived above their work, winter brought our narrow hours into gentler proportion. Bed so near, a brazier close, a cup, a loaf end, a candle nub. An apprentice slept wrapped in his own cloak in a corner behind a bench, and dreamed of the warm washer's steam in summer, when the river invited all and the day barely paused between its halves. The slow turn of the lens showed a room and then another, each ordinary in its good. Those who travelled spoke of roads as entities with moods. Some winter weeks set the clay like iron, and cartwheels sang. Some turned the surface to porridge and broke axles. Some glazed all with ice and made everyone walk as if on a boat. Travellers who reached a cottage door at dusk in hard weather were given hot broth even when beds were already full. The pallet that had been a child's became a guest's, and the child slept between kin without complaint. In such evenings, stories ran low and slow. News of a fair, a singing heard at a church feast, a story of a bridge mended, nothing sensational, no fear. A shared roof and the long quiet of winter made a homely companion of the night. Embers banked under ash, and the house breathed in one room as if it were a chest rising and falling in sleep. The tools that made a bed's comfort were few and carefully kept. Needles lived in a cloth roll, each pricked into its own pocket. A wooden comb smoothed flax fibres for spinning. A pair of shears trimmed a loose end from a blanket so it would not catch and run. A bone button, waxed to shine, held a bed curtain back in the morning and released it at dusk. A bed wrench hung from a peg and was not used for anything else. If a post loosened, a wooden wedge, tapped lightly into a mortise, made it firm again. Each of these small artifacts had a thrum of personal history in it. Hands remembered the way they felt. The patient ledger marked the absence of loss. No mislaid tool, no turned corner forgot, no rope left slack. Midwinter festivals cast a brief soft light. A green bough pinned above a lintel, a song, a shared pie of offal and roots, a cup of ale pressed on a neighbour and returned empty with thanks. In parishes with a little wealth, the church glowed like a low star. Within, the breath of people made its own warm weather, and the carved saints wore their winter faces kindly. At home, children woke early on feast days and then fell asleep faster than usual, as if the extra excitement had a gentle weight to it. Beds received them, and blankets, as always, laid down their steady argument against cold and wakefulness. The slow turn of the lens noticed how even the feast evenings ended with the same ritual. A poker set aside, a spoon laid down, a candle pinched, a last log moved into place to give itself quietly through the night. The year turned. By February's close, the first lambs were on the ground in upland places, and new tasks woke bodies earlier. Sleep began to shift towards spring's clock, yet the memory of winter beds lingered as a kind of learned knowledge. Straw made in autumn served a purpose through months when grass forgot its colour. Cloth woven in late summer argued sensibly with air that bit the ears. Herbs dried in sun gave winter back something of June's order. In everything that had been set aside, the patience of time could be felt. The patient ledger closed a page without ceremony and began a new one with the same neat hand. From one winter to the next, changes could be marked but not exaggerated. In a 13th century cottage near a lord's domain, a bed and a blanket. A century later, perhaps a second bed and a slightly better cloth. After a plague year, a labourer's wage with an extra penny, and a blanket bought outright instead of borrowed. After a run of mild winters, a roof that held its thatch longer. After a hard one, a hedge that needed more work, and a store of peat diminished. The slow turn of the lens accepted these as the substance of life. In monasteries and great houses, beds told another story. Curtained, feathered, bolstered, warmed with pans at retiring, set on carved frames. But the cottage's pallet remained the country's common instrument of rest. Its low value in coin did not match its high place in life. Infants learned to steady their hands on its edge, and elders leaned on it to rise. Labourers set their weight into it with a grateful sigh, and women in childbed measured pain and relief against its patient surface. In court rolls and registers a bed seldom spoke, yet now and then it is named, and in those moments its place is clear. A best bed, willed to a daughter, a pair of blankets left to a son, a flock mattress promised to a godchild. These were not extravagances. They were reckonings of care. Embers banked under ash, and the bed glowed in the mind as the place where labour's heat was finally exchanged for warm rest. As spring nibbled at the edges of fields and lanes, houses opened to air. Bed ticks were unstitched and straw shaken. New straw was cut fine and filled into the ticking with laughing sneezes at the dust. Lice were combed out, blankets hung on hedges on bright days. A bed's cords were retensioned with the little key, and then tightened again after the first night settled them. All this was done without proclamation. It belonged to the same housekeeping that had baked bread and mended shoes and set a kettle to simmer when someone had come in cold and late. The slow turn of the lens stood at a cottage door. watched warmth and sleep and order move like one thing, and did not attempt to say which mattered most. By summer, the memory of winter beds became a story told in shade, pleasant in retrospect because the present held heat and labour, and evenings spent out of doors until the light failed late. Yet when the geese were driven to stubble fields in autumn, and barley lay in long sacks in barns, and smoke rose from many chimneys again, winter nights returned, first as thought and then as fact, and the bed resumed its central office. There was no anxiety in this return, only the acceptance of a pattern proved and true. Some elders, counting many winters, slept earlier and woke earlier, and their households adjusted around them without fuss. A household with a new child built new rhythms into old rooms. A widow slept in a bed grown wide, and then shared her winter nights with a sister or a cousin when nights turned sharp. The patient ledger, turning its pages this time more slowly, held large changes with the same care as small ones. No debate troubled the hearth about where a bed should stand. It stood where it did the most good, near enough for the fire's saved warmth to drift across it, but not so near that a spark might find it. Away from a wall that faced the wind, under a roof sound enough to shed the drips when a thaw ran. In a one-room house it claimed a corner but did not fence the life around it. In a loft it watched over the room below like a quiet elder, hearing but not participating. In the longhouses it arched itself over beasts' breath and rested under their steady perfume of hay and hide. Everywhere, it was a geography of comfort known to those who lived there and to no one else. Winter sometimes brought music unplanned, the crack of ice at a bucket's rim, a late bird that mistook a candle for dawn, the rhythm of sleet on thatch, the rare thunder of a storm out of season, the very gentle sound of snow, which is mainly silence. Those who woke to such events did not rise at once. They listened, gauged, and went back to sleep. The bed made that possible, its padding, its cloth, its boundary that said to the mind, this is where warmth is kept and will be kept. The slow turn of the lens made no claim about happiness. It observed contentment and did not press it to prove itself. When spring fully took the hedgerows and lambs lost their early wobble, the bed's heavy blankets were folded and stored. A lighter covering lay where thick wool had been. The fire's banking grew less urgent. Windows, papered or horned, were lifted more often to air a room. Yet a woolen cap still hung by the bedpost because even in late April a night could surprise the unwary. Fuel remaining from winter was counted. If plenty, a little was kept back as hedge against a bad harvest's autumn. If scant, a hedge was cut and laid with more attention in May, so that faggots would be good in October. The patient ledger smiled again. It liked a house that learned and remembered. Years took families through their own cycles. Children who had slept on pallets grew into the bed on marriage. A former pallet now served a visiting cousin or an aging neighbour who needed close company in winter. Sometimes one household's bed moved to another as part of a marriage portion, or an old friend's quiet settlement. The bed kept its shape and its story in a new corner. The knowledge of how it was made and kept was not written down, but it was held close. A lore of hands and eyes and the tongue of the house that told someone there was still a draught at the north sill and that the seam at the foot needed a reinforcing line. The slow turn of the lens paid attention to this lore because it spoke a language of continuity that did not require parchment. So winter moved and people did not suffer it in vain. They managed it with tools plain to name and habits plain to describe. In these centuries, 12th to 15th, the Northern Ireland knew seasons of severity and seasons of temperance, and households met both with the same fundamental means. There were records of frozen rivers where fairs had later sprung, and there were records of wet, wild weeks when thatch needed tending twice. Both became parts of a winter memory that taught rather than frightened. Beds were the winter's calm ground. Straw, wool, linen, rope, wood, ash, ember, breath. Embers banked under ash. The patient ledger turned its last winter page each year and found that the account balanced not because of wealth, but because of care. When the year's orchard flower drifted and butter-yellow candles burned at dusk, the nights tugged a little earlier again. Children felt it first and slept with summer dirt still at knees and elbows until someone laughed and washed them gently. The first night of banking embers after the long light felt like the resumption of an intimate conversation. The room's contours grew more inward, voices softened, the bed's forms became once more the landscape of a night. There is satisfaction in return. Year on year, winter answered to it. The island's places differed. Moor, marsh, field, fell, sea edges and river bends, towns under bells, hamlets under wind. Yet in all of them, when cold took hold with a proper steadiness, a household snugged itself to rest in ways recognizable across width and time. This is the work the lens has traced without haste, and the ledger has reckoned without scold. The hearth's red heart has stood at the centre, and the bed has been its companion instrument. They held together a human order that was modest and good.